Hey there, writer rebels. One of the most popular and most confusing pieces of writing advice is show, don't tell. So join me today while we go through some concrete examples and help demystify one of writing's biggest mysteries. Hey there everyone, it's me Scarlett and welcome to my channel. If this is your first time coming here, thank you for hanging out, and if you have been here before, thank you so much for coming back. I am a YA author, YouTuber, and storyteller, and today we are going to be talking about the infamous show versus tell. Before we get into this, I do want to mention that my Stock Your Writer Library giveaway that I announced last week is still going on till September 7th. So if you'd like to grab some craft books or maybe a couple of my novels, make sure that you're entering that giveaway. I have included the link in the description box below. So if you do want to check it out, make sure you're hitting that link. It'll give you the entire layout of all of the books that are available for the contest and a place for you to enter. So just make sure you're getting into that contest because it does close September 7th, and after that it will be no more. So make sure you're entering. Okay, so today we are going to talk about show versus tell. So this is something that a lot of writers hear all the time, and it is very, very confusing. The reason it's so confusing is because it actually means a lot of different things. So when you say show, don't tell, it could mean a ton of different editing changes that could be made. So for me, I thought it might be easier if I broke down the top 3 or most common errors for show, don't tell that I see in amateur writing. When I say amateur writing, I'm talking about writers who have just kind of started out, haven't had a chance to work with an editor, or don't know that it's already in their prose. I also, when I say amateur, I mean my own writing. I did this when I first started. I had an editor who set me straight on a lot of these things, and a lot of my drafts still sometimes have this stuff in there. You have to be able to learn how to recognize these things in your own writing, obviously. So hopefully this video will be able to help you out, and it's going to clear up some of that stuff before you're handing it off to beta readers or an editor, which is going to save you time and potentially money if this is something that you are paying an editor for and you're self-publishing. Obviously, every time I put out a video, I want people to be able to make their manuscripts as best as they possibly can. So hopefully this is going to help you out with that. The other thing that makes show versus tell very confusing is the fact that sometimes you just need to tell. A lot of authors, if you pick up any book, traditional, self-published, whatever, there is going to be telling in these books. There are going to be people who are going to break the 3 rules that I'm just going to talk about. But the fact is, show versus tell is one of those things where you really need to know when to use it and when not to use it. And it's very important to understand when you want to use it and when you don't. It's one thing to understand it and choose to make that decision creatively than it is just to be using it blindly. As you've probably heard the old adage, you need to learn the rules before you break them. Show versus tell is one of those rules you should learn before you choose to break it. It's broken all the time, but it's broken for a reason. And if you're just doing it willy-nilly as opposed to breaking it for a specific creative or cadence to your sentence structure or whatever reason, then it's going to look amateur and it's going to weigh heavily on your writing. So hopefully I will be able to give some really good examples. You'll be able to understand a little bit more of show versus tell. Like I said, these 3 examples are not the ultimate list of show versus tell. These are just some of the bigger ones that I see very, very often in a lot of writing. So if you can at least master these 3, then you're going to be at least over halfway there. All right, so let's get started. So before I jump into the 3 main examples that I want to give, one of the things I want to talk about is generally what show versus tell means. So when you are showing something, you are giving the opportunity to really display what something means to a reader, whereas telling kind of pulls readers out of the story because it feels like something called author intrusion. And what that is basically the author is telling the reader what to think. They're telling them what to feel, and they aren't letting them experience the book through the eyes of the character, which is ultimately what you want to do. The deeper your point of view, so if you are working in first person point of view or a very deep point of view in third person, the more obvious this becomes because it really feels outside of the character. And the more outside of the character that you are, the more outside your reader is. And therefore they don't become as invested in your character and your worlds as they could be. So allowing yourself to be aware of show versus tell and understanding better what show versus tell means, you're going to be able to tighten up your prose and make sure that your reader is coming along for the journey and is enjoying and experiencing it as you would want them to. Okay, so the first example of show versus tell that I see a lot is when you are using descriptions. This is usually descriptions of people or places. So I did a video on how to deepen some of your descriptions, and a lot of that does play on this show versus tell. So you can check that out in the cards if you want to look at this a little bit more, and that was more based on setting. But I see it in character descriptions and I see it in setting a lot. And as with descriptions, as well as some of the other things I'm going to talk about, there's different levels of telling. So we're going to start out kind of like with the lowest level and kind of build our way up. And then I'll kind of give you some examples as to how you can recognize this in your own work. So in terms of descriptions, one of the things you will also see in a lot of these different things is the use of passive voice, the use of the words like were, was, had, all of those sorts of things. Those are going to take your reader out of your story because it feels like you are telling them what is going on. So in terms of descriptions, you could say things like, it was a beautiful day, or Bob's eyes were brown. These are going to be using passive voice. There's nothing particularly wrong with these sentences. And as I've said before, you might see them in traditionally published novels, well-edited novels, but they are going to be used sparingly. So what exactly is wrong with these types of sentences? They're not really showing you anything. For example, it was a beautiful day. You can say that, or you can show your reader what a beautiful day looks like. Is the sun shining? Is there a breeze? Is it very fall feeling? Is it summer? What makes it a beautiful day? What constitutes a beautiful day to your character? The other thing is, if they're a villain, maybe a beautiful day to them is awful outside. Maybe it's raining and all of those sorts of things. So you're not really giving that information to your reader. By telling them more about how the sun is shining and the leaves are flitting beautifully to the ground and all of those sorts of things, the reader is going to understand that it's a beautiful day. You don't need to tell them it's a beautiful day. They already know. You can show it to them by giving them the scene of what a beautiful day looks like. So that is kind of like the lowest level of show versus tell. You're basically telling somebody it's a beautiful day versus showing them what a beautiful day looks like. So hopefully you understand that. The next level is essentially kind of pocketing this stuff instead of spreading it out through your manuscript. So one of the things that I will see authors who are trying not to do it was a beautiful day is they will start their descriptions about a setting or a person and basically do an entire paragraph or half a page explaining every little thing about this day. So for instance, you could be opening a chapter and like I said, you could be talking about the leaves and the sunshine and all of that wonderful stuff. But if you chunk it all in one spot, it's still kind of telling. You aren't necessarily using so much telling language, but you're almost info dumping that information. A way to level that up essentially is to put it through your character's experience. So yes, the sun is shining when they wake up and they go out the door, but those flitting leaves are going to be as they're walking to school, as they're doing all these different things, they're experiencing that day. So to level up from that chunky description is to filter that description in as the character is experiencing it. You're going to pepper. I like to use the spice terminology because too much spice can ruin a dish, but not enough can make it very bland. So if you can spice up some of the things that you're doing with those descriptions, not only is your reader going to understand that it's a beautiful day, they're going to follow it along with your character and they're going to experience it, and it's not going to feel like a complete info dump. One of the times that I see this most often is when authors are introducing new characters. They will introduce a character, will walk into a scene and it's a brand new character we haven't introduced before, and they will go off on 2 or 3 paragraphs explaining everything about this character, what they look like, how they met them, all that sort of stuff. And basically what that is it's an info dump. So even if you aren't using that passive language like Bob's eyes were brown, Bob had a green jacket, it's going to still be weighing on that reader because you are just dumping all of that information. If you want to explain more about a character, you can filter that in a little bit. When they say something, maybe their brown eyes will light up as opposed to saying, Bob had brown eyes. You're going to get that peppered in throughout the conversation. You can have them shift on their feet and maybe describe their shoes at that point if this is something that you wanted to do. Or, they put their hands in their pockets of their green jacket. It's something a little bit more active, and it's going to be something that the reader is going to follow through a little bit better as opposed to just having that full description. So the three kind of stages of descriptions are that totally passive voice where you're basically just telling exactly what the reader should think. It was a beautiful day. Bob's eyes were brown. That second level, which is definitely more of an improvement, is being able to describe these things, but still chunking them into your prose and using them in big, large clumps. To level up from there, take those things and filter them out through your scene. Have your character experience them. Have things be peppered through your conversations, through their actions, and have your reader experience it along with your character. This is going to level you up from something that's going to be relatively basic and not super detailed to something that's going to be well detailed and well experienced for your reader, and that they're going to be engaged in and basically be able to pull them into your manuscript, which is obviously your goal. So how would you recognize this in your own work? Obviously, the passive voice is a little bit easier to find because you can find those telling words like was, were, had. Throw those into your search and find functions, and then as each of them come up, evaluate each sentence to see if that needs to stay or go. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with using those words, and used sparingly can be very useful. So as you're going through them, just really assess that sentence. Does it need to be there? Is another way that I can word it? Or is there a better way that I should be wording it? Should I be elaborating on it and bringing my reader in a little bit more? And the other way to find it is to look in the typical hiding spots in terms of setting and description. One of the most common places to find info dumpy type descriptions of settings is when you introduce a new setting or at the beginning of a new chapter. There's a lot of new chapters where you would start with setting the scene. So this is very, very common with many authors. You have to say where your chapter is taking place so people understand it. So a lot of chapter starters, and a lot of times when the setting changes, authors will dump a lot of descriptive information right at the beginning. So if you find that you have large chunks of description every single chapter heading or every single scene change, then you're probably going to want to change that up and see if you can smooth some of that out throughout the scene as opposed to chunking it all at the beginning. The other one that is the most common is the introduction of characters. Check when a character is introduced for the first time and see if you have large chunks or large paragraphs describing everything about that character. Those things can probably be filtered out throughout the book and may not even need to be fully in that chapter and could actually be further out throughout the story. These are going to be the places that are going to be a little bit more problematic. You can find them in other spots as well, but these are the typical places that they like to hide. The second thing I see quite often is when you choose to summarize and tell instead of dramatizing a scene out. So obviously this is a technique that does need to be used on occasion because you can't dramatize everything or things get a little excessive. So sometimes if you have a situation where, let's say, an epic fantasy where you have a lot of walking going on, you don't want to talk about walking for chapters and chapters and chapters. You're going to want to break that down to just a couple of sentences and tell that information to move on with the story. Just think about your normal day. When you tell somebody about your day, you only give them the highlights. You're not going to tell them about how you woke up and you rolled over and you showered. They don't care. And if you are putting all of these unnecessary details into your manuscript, it's going to bore your reader very, very quickly. So telling definitely has its place. However, there are situations where I do see people summarizing or telling when they should be showing. Two of the main examples for that is I will see where two characters are having a conversation, and instead of dramatizing that conversation, the author will choose to just tell that this conversation happened or that they were talking for 15 minutes and now we've moved on to something else. The problem with that is if they are imparting new information while that conversation is happening, then when you choose to tell it, you are pulling your reader out of the story when they have a chance to connect with the characters with just a few different types of dialogue. Throw in a few lines of dialogue and tell that information through the character, so showing that information as opposed to actually telling it, then the reader is going to be a little bit more engaged. They're going to get that in new information. If you just tell that information, then you are basically the narrator telling the reader what they need to think and what they need to know for the story to progress. It's not embedded in the story itself. So this is one of those situations that I find a lot with situations where maybe the chapter is getting a little bit long, or maybe they're not really sure how to switch between what they were talking about to this new topic, or whatever the situation may be, but they will try to pass time but still impart new information to the reader by telling or summarizing instead of dramatizing that out. The second time that I see this a lot is when you have something where you're kind of pivoting situations and moving from one thing to another, where something is being interrupted or something very sudden happens that we need to move on with. And the other thing that I do see with that very often is that they'll almost like pre-tell the scene before it happens. So one of the pieces of language I see there a lot is, oh, and they never saw this car crash coming. And then you're going to just describe kind of how the car crash happened or the reaction to that car crash, but you've essentially told your reader up front what's going to happen before it happens. This takes away a lot of suspense and drama from your story because you've told them what happens. You've essentially taken away the reason to read the scene. You're basically giving them the Cliff's Notes of what your scene is going to entail. You want them to experience it and move through it with your characters, to be engaged and to feel what your characters are feeling and experience what your characters are experiencing. By pre-telling something that's going to happen up front or not dramatizing something that should probably be dramatized, you are taking that away from the reader and telling or causing author intrusion, like I said before, because you are taking the reader out of that scene because it's not really in that character's POV anymore. So where are you going to be able to find this in your writing? Like I said, search and find is going to be very helpful. But some of the other tricky places that they hide are when you are changing scenes or changing kind of perspective. So you have a scene going on this way and then something is going to happen and it's going to move in a different direction. You can check those linchpins to see if you're moving from one thing to the other seamlessly, or if you've taken a break to tell in the middle so that you can pivot a little bit easier. It is easier to tell and set yourself up in a new direction, but some of those things need to be shown instead. If you have had readers as well, they may notice that there's an issue with pacing. It does impact your pacing quite a bit because it does feel disjointed. So if you are getting comments from readers, something is wrong with the scene, but they're not exactly sure what it is, then this might be something that you want to look at, that maybe you are summarizing things within a scene that you don't want to. On the flip side, if you find that your pacing is exceptionally slow, you should be looking at some of those showing scenes to see if maybe those need to be cut back, or maybe you can be using a little bit more of that telling language. And to be honest, sometimes these scenes are borderline and could really go either way. You could tell them or you could dramatize them, but you do want to make sure that you're taking a look at them to make sure that you're not losing an opportunity to dramatize something and to draw your reader in when it's sitting there for you to be able to use and you're choosing not to use it. And the third thing that is very show versus tell is filtering and naming of emotions. So at its most basic, it's going to be similar to descriptions where people are talking about emotions. Whereas I was sad, Bob was angry, Susie was jealous. In certain situations, this does make sense. For instance, in my book, Wicked Descent, I have a sentence straight up where I say, for the first time in his human life, he was scared. It is done for impact and it is done for punch. But typically, I'm not going to tell people what the emotion is that these characters are experiencing. It's similar to description. If you were saying it was a beautiful day, it's better to show the sun and the leaves. If you're trying to say Bob was angry, it's better to show that Bob is angry and not tell the reader that. If his face is turning red and he's throwing a chair across the room and his arms are shaking, you're going to understand that Bob is angry. It should play off the dialogue, his internal dialogue, if that's something that you're using, and the actions and feelings that Bob has, also what he's showing. So you do need to be aware of what character's point of view you're in. If you're obviously in a particular character's point of view, it might be easier to explain their emotions in first person, such as their heart beating faster or certain things that are happening inside the body. If you are talking from another character's perspective, then obviously you are not going to know what that other character's heart rate is doing or various different things. So you do have to be careful on that. However, there are ways to show outwardly on how people act, how they look, and what they say should be able to convey a specific type of emotion. So that's kind of like the lowest level of the show versus tell, is basically telling directly an emotion. One of the things that I do see when people try to level up this a bit, and I do use this too for impact, but I only use it sparingly, and I use it sometimes for the cadence of a sentence. But particularly, one of the things I'll see is people will describe that Bob is angry. So they will say about him throwing that chair or turning red or whatever, but then they will still add the Bob was angry. Or one of the sneaky little things is to avoid that passive language and would just say Bob threw a chair across the room in anger. So this isn't changing anything. You are still telling the reader that Bob is angry instead of just showing it. Readers are very smart. They will be able to figure these things out. And one of the reasons that sometimes authors will do this is because they are kind of nervous that the reader isn't going to pick up what they're putting down. So if they're trying to describe it, they want to make sure that that reader totally understands what they're trying to say. In most cases, if you've done it well, they will. So you just need to trust your reader that they're going to be able to figure these things out instead of adding those little things in there. And putting things like Bob threw the chair in anger is a little bit sneaky because you're not going to be able to pick that up on a search point for passive voice. You're actually going to have to read those things and be able to pick them out yourself. And it's definitely an improvement from straight up Bob was angry because you are now showing, but you are showing and telling, which is actually kind of overkill. So ideally, what do you want to get to there? You want to get to a point where you're describing your characters through dialogue, internal dialogue, personal, like outward description, inward description if it's applicable, and their actions to be able to show what their emotional state is. You really shouldn't have to name the puppy for the emotions that you're using. You should be able to convey that to a reader if you're doing things properly. Like I said, sometimes it helps with the cadence of a sentence, or you just really want to pack a little bit of extra punch by using some of those emotional words. And that's perfectly okay. But make sure that you know your rules before you're breaking them. If you are just littering your manuscript with all of these emotion tags, so anger, happiness, jealousy, all of those sorts of things, it's just going to look bogged down as opposed to adding that creative element that you're looking for. So how are you going to recognize these things in your writing? Obviously, anytime you have a scene that's going to be very heated, either, something an intimate scene, you're going to have an argument, you're going to have something where a character is very upset. Those heavy emotional scenes are a lot of places where those creep in there, especially because authors want to make sure that you totally understand that this scene is important and whatever it is that's happening, how it's impacting their characters. So this is a lot of the places where those little things will creep in. The other one that I see very, very commonly is with dialogue/action tags. So people want to hammer home exactly how that dialogue should be said. So making sure that people get the sarcasm, or that something is being said out of anger, or something is being said in a specific way. And they will have dialogue tags or action tags that are going to be very emotionally driven. And you're going to see that a lot with adverbs too. So you're going to see that if someone's angry, they're going to be Bob shouted angrily. So this, again, is pulling out that passive voice. You're not seeing the was, the were, so you might slide over that a little bit, but it's still doing the same thing. It's just naming that emotion, and just saying that Bob shouted is probably enough. If you don't think that's enough, then maybe you need to add a little bit more action of him throwing that chair across the room again. apparently he's going to have to buy more chairs. But by putting angrily at the end, you're just naming that emotion again, and you're going back to telling. If you are showing instead of telling, it's going to be a lot more impactful for your reader, because you're not telling the reader what to think. Use sparingly. Those naming adverbs can have a fantastic effect on your book. But if you are seeing every second dialogue or every second action tag include those adverbs, it's going to lose its impact, and it's not going to have that same punch that you're really hoping for in your manuscript. So as a quicker job, instead of going through every single dialogue tag, you can actually look for anything that has ly in it. It's going to be picking up a few more things, but it will also give you basically all of your adverbs, and you will be able to pick out the ones that are naming the emotions. And the last way that you can find some of this stuff in your writing is to look for your filter words. Another way to get around using passive voice is to use filter words. So this is stuff like felt, saw, that kind of thing, where you are basically pushing through something out of your character's perspective, such as Becky saw Bob run into the store. Bob just ran into the store. You don't need to say that Becky saw these things. So filtering can be a completely other video, but filtering is also a way that people get through naming emotions without having that was were. So Becky saw Bob to run to the store is a filtering sentence. But Becky felt scared. Becky felt anxious. This is naming those emotions again. So it's basically the same as saying Becky was scared, Becky was anxious. It's just saying it in a different way that kind of dresses it up a little bit, but it's still doing the same thing. It's still naming that emotion, and it's still telling instead of showing. So one of the things you can also do on your search find list is add those filtering words such as saw, felt, know, believe, all of those certain things, and it will be able to show you those places where you are naming your emotions instead of showing those emotions. And if you'd like me to talk more about filter words, I can definitely do that, but I think it's probably a video on its own, so I can save that for another day. Just leave that in the comments below, and it's something I will definitely consider. So if you are a little mystified about show versus tell, make sure that you are looking for these three key places. 1, your descriptions, particularly settings and character descriptions, that you are showing those people and those places as they are, and you aren't info dumping that information, that you are actually spicing it through your manuscript as opposed to just chunking it all in large pieces. Number 2, you are analyzing the areas where you're telling and making sure that you should actually be telling that information, and it's not something that should be dramatized or drawn out and acted through as opposed to just being a summary. And the third thing is you are not going to name your emotions unless you are using it sparingly. So making sure that you are showing characters' emotions through their actions, through their dialogue, through their personal appearance and how they feel inside, as opposed to just telling us how the character feels. So that's all I've got on show versus tell. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and if you did, make sure you're giving it a thumbs up so YouTube knows this is a video worth watching. Don't forget to join the Stock Your Writer Library giveaway that I have going on, and clicking that link below to check it out. If you are new to this channel and you would like to hear more content from me, make sure you're hitting that red subscription bar and the notification bell to let you know every time I put up a new video, which is typically on Thursdays. I will be back next week with a brand new writing and publishing topic, and for now, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.